that likes to bring together thought leaders across the worlds of arts, journalism, media, for courageous conversations and experiences that truly spark joy and curiosity, which is why Susan MacTavish Best was a brilliant co-conspirator, collaborator for tonight.
Thank
and
you.
So I'm going to be talking about her a little bit as she's right on stage, so I hope you're appropriately uncomfortable.
Very awkward, very
awkward. I'll tell you about Susan. By the way, did I tell you my name yet?
No.
Oh my God! So
Who
I could
are
be
you? What do you
anybody.
do?
I'm Fred Brown. My name is Christina Newman-Scott, and I work at the Greene Space as the executive director with a fantastic team. So, hello. Oh, thank you for the one woohoo. I'll get you a drink later. All right. So Susan MacTavish Best is the founder. Let me put on my reading glasses, people. Hold on. Here we go. Okay, because you know. I'm of a certain age. Susan MacTavish Best is the founder of POSTHOC, Inc., a company that celebrates the power of gathering by bringing us together to share ideas, stimulate conversations, spark connections, and build community. POSTHOC brings ideas to a curated community, connecting curious people with the world's most interesting thinkers, storytellers, and experts. For 2 decades, Susan ran Best Public Relations, a Silicon Valley firm she started when she was 24. Fundraising, launching new products, IPOs, hostile takeovers, and acquisitions. Okay. Susan has participated at all stages of the Silicon Valley ecosystem, and she is no stranger to putting startups on the map and building massive valuations of those companies, but more importantly, Susan loves WNYC, New York Public Radio, WQXR.
That's right.
Give it up for Susan MacTavish Best.
I do love my NPR. I grew up listening to it in Connecticut. So it's wonderful to be here. And this is our first, that I can think of, our first live public salon. Normally they're in private spaces. So it's really such an honor to see some familiar faces and then folks I don't know here in this public space, and also to support public radio, which is something that we all, every one of us, get to enjoy and also should support. So for me, salons are about bringing communities together and having conversations. Sometimes they're uncomfortable, but mostly they're fun. They're certainly unpredictable. And so who knows the direction this will go tonight. But I'm excited. So a good safe topic I thought to start off with would be sex. This is the one time in my life I'm going to sound like a pilot. So if you thought you were coming to an evening about knitting patterns, this is not the right show for you. This is not the right evening for you. This is an evening about sex and relationships and intimacy, and certainly something that every single one of you have a point of view on and have a little experience, I hope. So our guest tonight, or the fellow to whom I'm going to throw out some questions, and you are too, I hope later, is Dr. Justin Garcia. He's the executive director at Indiana University at their Kinsey Institute. Mm-hmm. And so we had a quick chat. We did a digital salon in early days of COVID. So that was a weird time. Do you remember that? It was like March, April. Do you have sex with a mask on? Can you do online dating? Should you kiss at all? What position should you use? I mean, no one knew at all. It was just all very awkward and a little uncomfortable. Justin's background, he has a doctorate, as I said. He's an evolutionary biologist. Where did you study? And what did you study?
Sure. So
I think it was about hookups, wasn't it?
Yeah, actually, that's it. You're right. That's right.
Guys.
So I started
more than any of you in here. He is the expert.
Yeah, academic. So I started my career. I trained in anthropology, and then I moved over to evolutionary biology. And early on, I was interested in casual sex. I was interested in casual sex because I was studying the evolution of pair bonding, of monogamy. And I thought, you're on a college campus. How do you make sense of the theory that humans, for over 4 million years, have had these intense pair bonds? We form these love bonds. But then you're on a college campus and everyone's having casual sex. So I really was just sort of it doesn't make sense. Make the world make sense. The what we're talking about in the literature isn't aligning with what people are doing around us.
Mm. Well, so the last time we chatted was early COVID days. And as I was saying, things were a little freaky. No one really knew what to do. what happened during COVID? I mean, were people going out and dating? Were they becoming more daring within their own relationships? Were there any random hookups? Now we're at the other end, hopefully.
Yeah.
What did you find on the science and research side?
Yeah, I love it. Thanks, Susan. and thanks, everyone. I'm so thrilled to be here with you all. So we found a lot of things, and I'll sort of jump around on some of the things we found. And so very early on, what we saw is, and at your point, I remember doing, we were joking about this the other day, I remember doing an Instagram live at the very start of the pandemic, and people were asking, like, should we wear a mask during sex, or should we have what I would call ventrodorsal sex, doggy style sex is what a normal person would call it.
What did you call it?
Ventrodorsal.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. What do you call it?
I've never heard that before.
Yeah. So, well, humans are one of the few primates that actually have sex facing each other, which actually is part of the story of intimacy, that we watch each other's reactions.
Guys, we're just getting started.
Yeah, we're just getting warmed up. Yeah. So, we won't. Give me a half hour. We'll get there. And so I remember doing this this Instagram live. There's like 10,000 people on there saying, well, should we have sex doggy style to be safe? And I'm like, I'm getting punked in front of 10,000 people. And then I realized, like, no, this is like, we're a species in crisis. People were trying to figure out what their sex life should be during the pandemic. So what we did at the Kinsey Institute, some of you might know, the Kinsey Institute is the sort of the largest, the premier sexological research institute in the world. So we've got over 20 scientists. We have a collection of over 600,000 items. Our running joke is it's the largest research collection of erotic materials. Our running joke is the only place with more erotic art is the Vatican.
Does the public have access, or do you have to like file a form to go?
No,
see
you
it?
can come. You can go to the Kinsey Institute.
It's
just
good reason to go to
kinseyinstitute.org.
Indiana University, guys.
Yeah. Why would you go to Southern Indiana? It's only for the Kinsey Institute. It's for sex. That's it. And corn, pretty good corn. And so that's true story. And so at the start of the pandemic, we were really interested in how this was shaping our romantic and sexual relationships. I've always been interested in how ecologies, environments, cultures shape the expression. As an evolutionary biologist, I'm interested in what are the universals that tether us together, but that they can vary. We know that these things vary in different environments, in different contexts, different parts of our lives. So what we found were a couple of contradictory things, actually. Among a large sample, so we did one of the first studies at the very start of the pandemic, and we watched people sort of throughout 2020. And what we found was initially this huge decline in sexual frequency. People were, for the most part, stopping having sex. And it wasn't
this just for the first few weeks, or did people have sex like within the first couple of days, as if like a hurricane came in or the Twin Towers went down and everyone's panicked?
I love that you brought that up. So scientists have been interested in often looking at reproductive patterns, and if it's a small stressor, if it's not a hurricane, but if it's a tropical storm, about 10 months later you see a baby bump.
I have some friends who literally she was in her late 40s. She was in the Caribbean on a remote island. Twins.
Yeah, they're not
unexpected. Very unexpected.
So we know that if it's this small thing, or the Oklahoma City bombing, some of you remember, 10 months later there was a baby bump. And so, but big things like 9/11 or a full-on hurricane, you don't see that. So there's small stressors.
It's anxiety.
Exactly.
It's anxiety.
So a small stressor makes you sort of turn to your partner and say life is short. A big stressor makes you think, and what COVID was this big stressor. You're worried about the economy. We're worried about, one way I like to think of it is that we went into a threat response. So many of us went into a physiological threat response. Two gazelle will never mate in front of a lion, right? If your body is in a gazelle response, right? Actually, early in my career, I wanted to do this study where we have a sexual psychophysiology lab at the Kinsey Institute, and where you can measure arousal. And I wanted to bring people in, and I wanted to pump smoke under the door and set off fake alarms to see how quickly we could shut off an arousal response.
Oh, wow.
And the then director, I remember being at lunch and so excited. I was like a young postdoc. I was like, isn't this a great idea? And she just looked at me. She goes, are you insane? And she was a clinical psychologist, which made it worse. But I still think it was a good idea.
It's a great idea.
So we know that people were in this physiological threat response. So we saw it tamp down all over the world in a multinational study. Frequency of sexual activity went down. But there was an interesting catch. About 1 in 5 people reported expanding their sexual repertoire. So although our frequencies went down, people started reporting trying new things.
Within the relationship they were in, or were they out
Yeah.
seeking new relationships?
So we saw a dramatic decline in seeking new relationships, but for people that were in a relationship, whether it was casual or serious. And interestingly, a different finding we had from another round of the study about people were still looking for partners, but they were trying to mitigate risk. So in our sample, 1 in 5 had sex with a non-romantic roommate. Yeah, because you kind of know, if they can make waffles already, right?
Yeah.
And people were turning to those that they knew something about, that there was some
It
sense
felt
of
safer
comfort.
in a time of anxiety.
Yeah.
It felt safer to
Yeah.
be around someone who's familiar.
Yeah, that's exactly
Yeah.
it. And that sense of safety that could kind of calm us, be that quiet in the storm. So although we saw these decreases in frequency, about 1 in 5, about 20% had tried something new. And a lot of it, I think this is so interesting, a lot of what people were trying was the first time that they ever turned to a partner and talked about a sexual fantasy. It was the first time they ever
I mean,
sexed it.
you'd run out of things to talk about after 3 weeks,
Yeah,
right? It's
yeah.
like,
But-
it's like it's going to go on for a while, right?
Yeah.
Do you remember that?
But also, what an indictment on our relationships that it
Yeah.
took being locked up for
Yeah.
so many millions of people to finally turn to their partner and say, hey, is there anything we never tried that you want to talk about?
Yeah.
Although I think you know the story. Months later, I was humbled a little bit by how excited I was by this study. I was interviewing a couple, woman and a couple first. Sometimes we'll interview people separately and then the couple. And she said, well, my husband and I started having shower sex during COVID. And I said, well, that's wonderful. Tell me more. And she said, well, it was really the only time. So I said, well, that's consistent with our data. As a scientist, the world around you confirms.
Dr. Justin Garcia.
Yeah, it confirms what I found. And then she said, well, it was the only time we could get 5 minutes away from our kids. And I thought that was interesting. A lot of people were trying things as sort of ingenuity. They were trying to be creative. And then I said, well, let's talk about the 5 minutes. We could do better than that.
Yeah. So how did one night stands fare during COVID?
So for the most part, what we saw was a couple things. I don't want to, as someone who studied hookups, I don't want to say hookups are over. They're not, and they won't be. But what we really saw was a shift, and particularly over the long haul. So when we look at data over that whole first year, that a lot of people were shifting from more focus on dating, going on video dates. So we saw that over 70% of Americans were open to video dating. 69% said they could fall in love on a video date.
And they weren't doing this beforehand, right?
No, we had data that we actually coincidentally had data, and
Can
no
you
one.
imagine someone be like, "Oh, you want to have a Google meetup or something?" Like that's not so hot.
Yeah, no, and no one was. I mean, no one was doing it, right? That there were very low rates of people doing it. Maybe if you were long distance, if you were set up by a matchmaker. Years ago, I gave a talk at the Matchmaking Institute, which is all professional matchmakers, and at the very end, at the time I was single, and someone who introduced me said, "Oh, and he's single." So then I would have all these video dates, but it was because it was like one was in Tokyo and one was in Toronto, and
right.
But for the most part, we didn't really practice that. So there's been this shift in how we use technology. I'm actually convinced that video dating is here to stay. It's cheaper, it's easier, it's less effort, it's less risk. You can do a vibe check.
Does anyone here in the audience do video dating, or like on their first date want to do a video? Yeah, people. Yeah. I mean, why not? Like, why waste your time?
Yeah,
right?
Yeah, and it's easier than getting dressed up and knowing and it's also safer. One of the things we found in our new round of data.
Safer? In what way?
One of the things we found in our new round of data, and I think this will resonate with people, but I didn't realize, as a scientist, I need numbers, and then it makes me wake up. And the degree to which how many American women said that they occasionally feel unsafe on the dating market. And, even in big cities like in New York and in LA and Miami, and that people were really writing in and saying, well, they want ways. So actually, a lot of the dating apps now do a background check. A lot of them have features now that you can sign up for background checks, at least to look for.
What about a credit report as well? No. Yes.
No, you need a good friend for that. Yeah. Yeah, but it is this sense that we kind of have these legitimate anxieties about when we're dating. So for over a decade, we've been doing a project with Match.com called Singles in America. And we try to get a real sense of people's attitudes, and that's where we're seeing that there is a lot of anxiety about dating, and it's not unwarranted.
So I want to get to the Match.com work that you're doing, but back to COVID. Mm-hmm. Slow love, is this here to stay?
I think so. So with slow love, my colleague Helen Fisher and I, biological anthropologists, what we've argued is that what Helen initially argued was. What we're seeing in the data is this pattern that so many of us, our parents or our grandparents' generation, they would only date for a short period of time, and then they would start a marital relationship, right? Marriage was the sort of start of a relationship in many ways. And what we see with this generation is people hang out for a while, right? I still remember many years ago, I was out with someone and we ran into our friends and they said, "Are you two?" Said, "We're hanging out." I was like, "What the fuck does that mean?" And, excuse me. And I was like, "I study this. I don't know what that, I legitimately don't know what you just said." And
it's very vague.
Yeah, it's very vague. But that's the point.
No one's committed that much.
And that's exactly the point. Yeah, we're hanging out, right? It's
checking each other out.
Yeah, we're doing a vibe check. I'm getting to know your social network. You're getting to know my social network. We're getting to see what we eat, what we drink, what places we hang out. Then that can go on for months. Then maybe we date for months or years. And then maybe we're engaged for months or years. That is a radical transformation in a courtship process in a relatively short period of time. Remember, I'm an evolutionist. I'm interested in monogamy evolved 4 million years ago. So the idea that just in a few decades we've seen this radical shift in how we're establishing relationship. So slow love, the punchline is that for centuries, marriage was the sort of start of a commitment of families, of a relationship. But for this generation, marriage is the finale. It's when you know everything about a person. You've reduced your risk. You want to mitigate any kind of concern about, are they going to cheat? Are they going to leave? What are their finances? Who are their friends? Where have they been? Who have they slept with? What can I find on every social media platform?
Do you think you know too much?
People or me?
No. Not you. You could learn more. But people walking into relationships like this, there's maybe no mystery left.
I think the question is, it's a very important question. And I think it's that what we end up doing often is we start to hedge too much. So you learn so much information. You say, well, you're so perfect, but why did you like that cat picture 6 months ago? And I would have never liked that cat. So we start making assumptions about people. And part of the big challenge of the digital age is we all have this sense of this infinite resource of people we can date. Now, this goes back to being an evolutionist.
That's an issue on dating, right? It's like you're on a date and...
Yeah.
You could be sitting there. I've never done online dating, but I would imagine you could be sitting there and you're like, the way you chew is slightly annoying.
Yeah.
There's probably 9,999 other people who might chew in a different way.
Yeah.
Instead of going through with it. You know?
And that's the amazing thing with the apps, right? Yeah. So we're in a world where we have this sense of an infinite resource that we can kind of just go out. And the big challenge is, and actually economists study this a lot, is that we don't put both feet into the date in front of us because we have too much choice.
Too much choice. So, I know this because I have a lot of people over to my home and host a lot of folks. And cooking 14 different dishes is far too much for us humans.
Yeah.
It's much better to have one cocktail, maybe two, and 3 or 4 dishes. We don't need that much choice. People are much happier with a little less choice.
And there's great studies that show that. I always think personally, did you ever go to Cheesecake Factory, the restaurant? Susan probably doesn't.
I go all the time.
Yeah. And you read this menu, and it's this Bible,
it's too much. It's glossy. It's big.
And you think, I've had the same goddamn salad for a decade because I can't get through the menu.
It's also a really big salad.
It is. It's very big.
And it's got a lot of ingredients.
Yeah. But we have this, what we call this sort of this paradox of choice, that when we have too many options, we have a really hard time focusing in on one. And what we know is in the dating sphere, the same thing happens. Actually, a lot of what goes on, I bring up salads because foraging psychology is quite similar to mating psychology when we're looking at what the available options are. In one of my favorite studies, they gave people a fake online dating apps, and they gave one group 24 fake apps to choose a partner from, and another group 6 fake apps to choose a partner from. And they followed up with them a few weeks later. And you would think the people with 24 had more options, they could feel more confident.
It sounds very stressful.
It was. Yeah, you would put you in the 6th group.
You
it's
couldn't
okay.
possibly
and
sleep. You'd be thinking about it at all times.
Exactly. So the people who had 6 were a lot
doubting
happier
yourself.
with their choice. Because exactly that, they weren't doubting themselves. If you have 24, you go, well, there was that one that had the blue shirt or the weird mustache or the, and you start to imagine the possibilities, the opportunities that exist, and we can kind of get ourselves in this headspace with dating that we imagine there's all, like you said, the chewing, healthy relationships. What we know from all this literature, it's not about the person who's perfect; it's the person whose faults you can live with.
Right.
Yeah.
So you've had this partnership in your lab at Kinsey with Match.com. They certainly probably have a lot of data there. There's a lot of people there. What has the partnership been? And it's been mostly looking at singles?
Yeah, for the Match Project, it's called Singles in America. And every year we collect a new sample of a little over 5,000 single Americans. So it's not people on the app or on the website.
Okay, that's interesting.
It's a demographically representative sample. We've occasionally done studies on the app. We did one on pets, actually, on people who use pets, not to take us on a side train. We did one on, so we know that there are these studies that if you walk through a park with a puppy, it's easier to get someone's phone number. And we did one on how people are using puppies and pets in their pictures and in their app, and how they also rely on them. So you'll have a date and someone over to your house and say, well, my cat didn't like you, this can't work out. And what pets
but
people...
also it's kind of true, maybe.
Yeah, right? And what pets people find attractive. And I remember being in this meeting with all my colleagues, other scientists, and the marketing team at Match, and people were like, okay, dogs are important, cats, and I was exotic pets. And no one, if you post pictures of exotic pets
the
on your dating app,
reptiles, it's a very subculture.
I know.
Yeah.
It is, but I thought, like, as a scientist, I was like, I want to meet someone who has a toucan in their picture, but most Americans don't. So.
Any trends on the Match, the work that you've been doing with Match, around race and ethnicities?
Yeah. Oh gosh, that's a very good question. So actually, Match owns a lot of the. So there's what's called niche dating apps. So you can do a farmer date, Black people meet, Jewish dating, right? So we know that people will sometimes try to date. It's what sociologists call homophily.
So they own a lot of the niche ones. Is that what you're starting to say? Is it IAC, the parent company?
IAC,
I can't remember. Yeah. Barry Diller.
So
right.
yeah, exactly. And they have People Media has over 20 subsidiary sites,
Okay.
and they. So we know what sociologists call this homophily. We tend to date someone of the same socioeconomic background,
does
religious
homophily
background,
mean?
that we assort based on some commonality. Same religion, same ethnicity, same socioeconomic background. But we're seeing a generation that is more open than any other generation in American history to expanding that.
Is this Gen Z? When you say you're seeing a generation?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, that are sort of expanding that. But we still know that we gravitate towards people on a commonality. But what's interesting about race is that when we look at some of the data and particularly in sexuality and race, a lot of it is actually driven by religion. So a lot of it is attitudes about sexuality. So for instance, we do see differences between Black Americans and white Americans in sexuality. But the question as a scientist, when we try and say what's driving the effect, part of it is that those groups vary in their religiosity and their religious tendencies. So is it that race is driving some of the differences we've seen between these groups, or is it a systematic difference in religion and religiosity between those groups that are driving the pattern? And those become really complicated questions to sort of disentangle. But it also goes to this sort of question of like intersectionality, that we have sex, gender, religion, race, ethnicity, all kind of piling in at once that shape the rich diversity of our intimate lives.
Are there any geographical trends with the singles?
Oh, gosh.
Can you tell us about New York
Yeah.
versus Miami or LA,
Yeah.
San Francisco,
Yeah.
or Ohio?
Yeah. Oh, Ohio. Yeah. Don't go to Ohio. And so we I actually
We
like
love
Ohio.
Ohio.
I love Ohio.
Yeah, we love Ohio.
So we know that in urban spaces that sometimes people's dating lives can vary. But again, you run into that problem of sometimes there's too much choice. So one of the things we see is that particularly in urban spaces, you really have a sense of an infinite resource. Whereas if you're more rural, you might actually focus a little bit more. So we actually have a lot of reports of people in big cities like New York, LA, Miami, reporting that they find dating extremely difficult. Even though you say, but there's ocean. Why? And it's partly
It's
that
too much choice.
it's
Like
too much
you always
choice.
know there's going to be,
Yeah, or like
No
we
one
were
can-
joking about Queens versus Manhattan. Like people are like, well, you're wonderful, but I can't go to Brooklyn to date you.
But I couldn't possibly date someone from Queens. Or,
Yeah,
you
yeah,
know, yeah.
yeah, and we-
Staten Island? What? No, I
Yeah.
mean, maybe not. Staten Island wouldn't come here.
Exactly, and
Yeah.
we start to then create these boundaries of what we think, and then when you sit back, you go, okay, this is not rational in any way, and I
That's
love
so
it,
exciting.
and now we're going to do an experiment where you find your partner, and so reach under your chair, so that'd be great, yeah. Sorry. Earlier in my career, I did a study in a sex club in Las Vegas where we took hormone samples. So like nothing phases me. That very well could be an experiment. So we know that in those spaces that we can sometimes actually find it more difficult as opposed to more sort of suburban or rural spaces because we have a sense of what the available options are.
How much does attraction matter these days? Like, yeah.
Yeah.
Is that important still?
Of course, yeah.
No, but is it like post-COVID, during COVID?
Yes.
Do we still find, I think that person's hot. Important.
I love how you said that. Yeah, who wouldn't believe you? And so we know that attraction does matter, right? It certainly does. What draws us to one person of another, but also kind of what is that, right? I think I've always been interested in what is it. How is it that sometimes you can walk into a room and someone across that room grabs your attention, right? What is it about them we get pulled towards each other? And there's a lot that's there. As a biologist, sometimes it's the sound of their voice, it's their body language, it's their posture, it's their dress, it's their facial
it's always
symmetry.
Something weird, mostly.
Yeah.
We know that as humans,
Yeah,
right?
well, speak for yourself. And so... but...
Okay.
we're old friends, sorry. And so
I feel like you have big news to announce at the end of the night, by the way. And if you don't behave, I'm going to announce it.
Okay, all right, I'll get that.
Just got to rein him in for a moment.
So we know that the things that draw us to each other, that they can be, but what's interesting is we so often think it's physical attraction, and that's part of the problem with the apps also, is we focus on physical attraction.
That's what I really meant, was
And the number one attraction in all of our data, in all of our big studies, for both men and women, no gender difference, is kindness, humor. So although we know that the physicality is important, part of what we're looking for, and that's a distinction, I think, to what you were saying before, Susan, is between like a hookup in a relationship and if you're looking for a long-term relationship, so when the sexes have different needs in evolutionary terms, we expect them to have gender differences, right? We expect there to be a different in terms of their evolutionary story. But in terms of pair bonding, it's not sexually dimorphic. Yeah. Everyone's looking for the same thing in their partners. And often that's kindness, it's honesty, it's humor, things that we feel that we can be drawn to someone. That doesn't mean you want someone that you have some attraction to, but physical attraction to. But we often, in long-term relationships, we're looking for someone we can build a life with. And those are different traits. They're different things that, in some ways, the apps aren't set up to search for that.
Mm-hmm. We've done a salon on this, but I'm wondering, as a researcher and scientist, you can succinctly tell us, what is falling in love?
I like that you told me succinctly. That's not one of my strengths. So I'm a professor. I like to profess.
I'll cut you off. Cut you off.
Thank you. That's friendship.
And okay, well, okay. What is falling in love? Like scientifically, what it is, and who falls in love more, men or women?
Oh, God. That's a good question.
I know.
So when I define falling in love, we often we talk about focused attention, intrusive thought, obsessive thinking. It sounds like a disease. And in many ways, it operates in the brain remarkably like addiction. And actually, when you pull it away, my colleagues put people who are romantically rejected into a brain scanner, and they look remarkably like someone going through cocaine withdrawal.
But it's probably just for a few months, right?
And actually, but to your second question, so actually, not only are men, and studies that have been done, men say "I love you" first in most relationships, and among Americans, but they also take longer to get over breakups. And men are much more likely to kill themselves in a breakup, and they're much more likely to commit suicide following a relationship dissolution. About 9 times more likely.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, women are survivors.
Yeah. And it's a different. So in some ways, I think the story of men in relationships is more complicated than we give credit for. In part because of the way that gender plays out, right? How we have these sort of expectations of what a relationship looks like.
There aren't too many books. I don't know. I'm thinking right now. I mean, Florence Williams did just write one about falling in love and then having her heart broken. By her husband, it was a scientific study of it, but it's mostly men, really, I think, in literature, isn't it?
Yeah.
Who write, and maybe same in music. Okay, well, quickly moving on to another topic, let's talk about abstinence and TikTok. So.
Oh, you're so good. I love it,
Yeah. So that's become a little bit of a thing. What's that about?
Yeah, so there's well, when we talk about abstinence, there's sort of two things that often come up. One is the sort of extremist, like incels, right? People who have
What's that?
So an involuntary celibate, incels, right? So which have been
Okay, guys.
associated with.
I feel so stupid. I didn't know.
No. Why would you? It's not.
It's
You
not
don't.
me,
This
yeah.
is weird things I do at work. Not most people. And so incels or involuntary celibates, they've been associated
Otherwise
with
known
sort
as dopamine fasting in Silicon Valley.
yeah,
By the way.
yeah. Oh, that's interesting.
Big trend.
Really?
Yes, absolutely.
And
Yep.
like in all over there, in all.
No
what's
sex,
what's
no
the idea?
coffee, no ice cream. Focus.
That's bad. That's bad. That's bad.
Obviously, it's bad. We know
Oh.
it's a terrible trend, but it's
Yeah.
a moment.
I know.
So-
Every so often we'll hear from athletes. There's always this thing like, should athletes have sex the night before a game, and does it, to ramp up dopamine and testosterone? And there's actually not very good evidence one way or the other.
Yeah.
And
Makes you feel mentally strong.
Yeah.
Perhaps.
But it is so interesting. I love that you bring that up. The way that we experiment with our own bodies, particularly around things like sex and sexuality.
Well, I think it makes us feel strong.
Yeah, in control.
Yes.
Yeah.
In control. So, but that has become a thing, I think, on TikTok, right? Abstinence.
Yeah, so there's sort of two camps that we're seeing. So one is this sort of what we would call incels, involuntary celibates. Some of you might have heard it in terms of like mass shooters. Sometimes they're referred to as, they also are involved in these sort of incel online groups. These sort of, they tend to be pretty misogynistic. They tend to be anti-sex. They tend to be, there's a suggestion, particularly for men, that they're entitled to sex in women's bodies and they haven't been able to get that access. And so there's sort of that group. But then there's another group that researchers that are not as pathological, and that's more what you and I were talking about. The sort of new Victorians are sometimes referred to, and that's this sort of Gen Z that we're seeing actually. So what it is, it's not that sex is decreasing; it's the proportion of virgins that are greater. So when we look at it, so if we take a snapshot,
at an older age, right? I
Yeah.
mean, that's what you're meaning.
Yeah, so if we take a snapshot of 16, 17, 18, 19, 20-year-olds, and we look at a decade past, the proportion that were sexually active is shrinking. So actually we're seeing that less, what it looks like, so some of you remember like a few years ago, The Atlantic had this cover story on the great sex recession, and everyone was like, what does it mean? Are there hormones in the
never read it,
diet? Are we
yeah.
not having sex? Like, it's the end
Was
of the
this
world?
during COVID or before it?
Right before COVID, yeah, right before.
Gosh.
And what we actually see is it's not that. So if you look at like single people, for instance, their frequency of sex hasn't declined in the last few years, adjusting for age. But it's the proportion that are not entering the sexual, I was going to say market, but it's not the right word. But they're not having sexual activity that's growing. And scientists like sexologists that I work with are still debating what that means. Like, why is that the case? What's going on that people are remaining sexually inactive?
I love the term skin hunger, which is a term that you introduced me to when I first chatted with you in early COVID. Can one night stands be simply about intimacy?
They can, right? And I think that's what's so this idea of skin hunger, the sort of the thirst for the flesh, right?
We all know what it is,
Yeah.
right? Everyone does. We're human, whether it's just someone touching you and
Yeah.
putting your hands on you and.
Yeah, and we're a social mammal.
Right.
We have a history of licking and grooming and hugging and all sorts of physical. We have one study a different study. We surveyed 1,000 partnered Americans, and 34.4% said they're not touched enough by their partner. And my poor Kinsey Institute
it's
colleagues.
so lonely, right?
It is. That's just such a
Makes you feel
sad.
sad. Yeah.
I know. So my poor Kinsey Institute colleagues, for about 6 months, I ran up and down the halls and saying, "It's a touch crisis. We're in America's touch crisis." And finally, my colleague Amanda Gesselman was like, "You've got to stop. You've got to like." I was like, "Okay, fine." But it is this idea that we want this sort of physical, this sort of connection. My colleague Roy Baumeister says, the need to belong is deep in sort of the human. It's a deep human motivational drive, as deep as thirst and hunger, is to feel connected to another human being. So I forget, what was I saying? I got distracted thinking about.
I'll just move on to the next thing. Let's talk about dick pics and sexting.
That's a good
What
segue.
are the cost benefits of sexting?
Yeah. So with sexting, I think there's a lot of moral panic around it. And I actually have two thoughts. On the one hand, I think I think sexting can actually be good for some people, for relationships. And actually what we found in our data is that it's more common in established relationships than among people that don't know each other. So if you're in long distance, if you're building intimacy, because part of what is important for a relationship is a sense of trust. And sending an erotic image or a message to each other, you sort of are engaging in this this vulnerability, right? Because this idea that you could share it with other people, and there's a sense of trust that you build. The problem is that particularly among young people, they do share it with other people. And we found that about, if I remember correctly, 19% of women and 24% of men have shared a sext. And when they do, they share it with 3.5 friends or more.
So you better look good.
Yeah.
Just do it in good lighting
Yeah.
and look good, or think twice.
I love it. I'll never forget my nieces had this like high school program about sexting, and I mean, they're telling me this, and I'm like, let me get my laptop out. This is what they're telling you is bullshit. I have data, and so they're telling me about like this 2-period class that they had on sexting and how it can ruin your life. I was like, if you ever sext, don't have anything in the background that's recognizable. Don't have your face in it. And I still remember my mom comes running in from the other room. She's like, what the hell are you telling the girls? And I was like, we have to be realistic. Like, people are doing this behavior, but how do we help mitigate risk? Like, look good. Don't let people see your face. Don't let it be identifiable. Because the issue is the non-consensual distribution of sex.
Right.
But there's also what we found is
it a bit about power? What is it about?
Oh God, you're so good. And so we know that some of it is about a sense of control, but a lot of it is what we call a sexual misperception bias. And what we see is that we surveyed single men, and we surveyed single women. Have you ever received a photo and cross sexual orientations? And what a lot of men were saying was, I sent it because it's playful. I sent it because I thought she wanted it. I sent it because, and heterosexual men, gay men said the same thing. But when we asked heterosexual women, they said, no, I never asked for it, and I find it gross, and I find it demeaning, and I find it... So there's this sense that it's kind of playful. Now, among gay men, it is. Like, if on an app like Grindr, you routinely will sell genital images. So there's a context in which that is the case. But heterosexual men somehow thought, well, I can do this too. And it's not the case, right? It's often viewed as and actually...
The audience isn't so receptive.
Yeah, exactly. And it's what certain states, initially Texas and now California, I mean, talk about strange bedfellows, Texas and California, are both passing legislation that make unsolicited sexting a crime.
Wow.
Yeah, sex crime.
But also not such strange bedfellows, because so many people from California went to Texas.
Yeah.
Monogamy.
Yeah.
Have you done some research around that?
Yes.
Some people are really into it. A lot of people are really into it.
Most people are. Most people around the world. And I'm just curious, who here has a cat? Who has a cat? Oh, interesting. Not that many. So about 1/4 of Americans have cats. This is my colleague Amy Moore says this. She's a psychologist at Chapman University. So about 1/4 of Americans have cats. About 24%. Similar percent have
I like this lighting. It's good, actually.
Yeah,
you can
I
keep
know.
this lighting. You don't need to bring it up. I
Yeah.
think this is fun.
Yeah,
This
yeah.
is fun. Keep it low.
Yeah, it was
Too
perfect
bright.
for what I was about to say.
Yeah.
And so about 24% of Americans have a cat. Roughly close to the same number of Americans have ever, at some point in their life, had a consensually non-monogamous relationship, an open relationship of some sort, whether it's swinging.
C&M, never knew that was a term.
Yeah, that's what we call it in the literature.
I know, I learned.
So it could be open relationships, it could be swinging, it could be, so separate from infidelity, which would be non-consensual, non-monogamy.
Right.
So what that tells us, now, if we take a snapshot right now, how many Americans are in that kind of relationship? A lot less, around 5%. But what it tells us is that people sort of dabble in that. So the majority of Americans are pretty committed to both social monogamy, the pair bond, romantic love, and sexual monogamy, sexual fidelity, exclusivity. So we know that. And that's true around the world. Often people will say to me, like, well, there's societies all over that practice non-monogamy. And that's true. There are societies around the world. But in most cases, about 85% of people in those cultures that practice non-monogamy still partner monogamously.
So they're still coupled up with someone, and they
Yeah.
have each other's back, I think is kind of what you're saying.
Yeah. And
They have each other's back. It's
Yeah.
not like they're randomly sleeping around. They have a safe person who will look out for them in case something happens.
Exactly. It's that social monogamy, that pair bond relationship, the principal relationship, even if you have some sort of sexual openness beyond that. It's that need to belong. It's back to that connection.
Jumping onto another topic, baby talk.
That
often crops up in couples.
With
what
your
is that
smile,
about?
I thought I was like, we're going to do it.
No, I do it all the time anyway. What does it mean?
So we did a study many years ago. So when mothers talk to babies in baby talk, it's called motherese, and then when fathers do it or other caretakers, it's called parentese. And we do it to our dogs, we do it to our pets, right? It's a higher pitched voice, and you'll talk to them in a way that you think is engaging. And actually, it is for babies. It is engaging. I grew up as that sort of Dr. Spock generation where parents would talk to you like a little adult, and now we know that's insane. It's not a little adult. It's a child. Talk to it like a child, and but we know that. So loverese is the term that we
Loverese.
Loverese. So when lovers talk to each other, and it happened. It was the very end of grad school, and I lived with a couple, and I remember one night in the living room, and I was on the phone with a friend. And they said, who wants the ice cream? I'll get the ice cream. I'll get the ice cream. You want a spoon or 2 spoons? We'll share a spoon. And I remember thinking, I'll get you the goddamn ice cream. Just stop. But what they were doing is what we see a pattern of what couples do is called make special. And in relationships, we often want something with our partner that's sort of unique and special. Maybe it's a nickname. Maybe it's a pet language we use with each other. Maybe it's something we wear. Maybe it's something we do in the bedroom. It could be anything. But we want these special moments that connect us to our partner, that are kind of intimate, that aren't shared with the whole world. Like you don't, at work all day, you don't talk in, I hope you don't, talk in loverese. So what we found actually was that about half of people in our sample occasionally did it, and about a third did it at least once a day. Yeah.
Oh, that's sweet. So I think I'm going to ask 1 or 2 more questions, but for production, in terms of opening it up to the audience, maybe we'll do that in like 3 or 4 minutes. There's so much more to talk about. I'll leave it to the audience to get to kink and what have you. I'm not going to get to everything here.
I didn't know that was on the table. Okay,
it's totally on the table. Well, maybe it's not. Maybe it's not. We'll leave it to the audience. But cheating. Mm-hmm. So, if someone cheats, does that mean you no longer love your partner?
Oh, I love that you asked this. So I love it. Thank you.
You're welcome.
So we know. No, and I think that's one of the biggest misperceptions. So I've studied infidelity for 15 years, and
that's a long time.
Yeah, right. It's a long time because I've always been interested in these variations of monogamy, and I just realized how old I am. And so we know that when people cheat. So we did one study fairly recently on motivations for infidelity, and we found that 8 distinct, statistically, there's 8 distinct motivations of why people commit infidelity. And I think one of the big challenges that we all have, if you've ever been in a relationship and someone's cheated on you, if you've been in a relationship and you've cheated on a partner, is we often think that's it. It must be that there's what's called the deficit model, that there must be a deficit in my relationship. There's something I didn't provide to them, or there's something that that they don't provide to me. But in fact, what we see is that a whole lot of infidelity in established relationships, it's situational. So it's you were out drinking in a bar, you were away at a conference, you were sort of in a particular situation. And it's really made me think about if you're in a relationship and you say, I want to maintain this relationship, the question has to be flipped. Not why do we cheat? We know the reasons why people cheat. Why do we not cheat? We all have the capacity, if we're in a relationship, to have sex with someone
else. Is it about
else.
Curiosity?
For some people, for some of them, it's curiosity. Some it's anger, actually. Some they're upset with their partner. Okay. Some they don't know how to get out of a relationship. Sometimes for the curiosity and novelty, we did a study many years ago on a dopamine receptor gene. People with a DRD4 gene, they're more likely to abuse alcohol, more likely to jump out of airplanes. They're 50% more likely to commit infidelity. And when they do commit infidelity, they do it more often. So it's novelty. It's like you said, curiosity and sensation seeking. So I think what that tells us, what the science tells us, is there's plenty of people who stray in their relationship. It's not because there's necessarily a problem in their relationship. So as I've thought more about it, I've often thought, people, when they say, I struggle with fidelity in my relationship, I often think, well, what situations are you putting yourself in that can encourage that? We all have the capacity for infidelity in a relationship. That is built into our DNA as a sexually reproducing primate. What do we do to prevent that? Don't go out drinking with the sex that you're attracted to, and without your partner. And I don't say that as I say that I sound like the conservative, focusing it. That's not the point. My point is really that we can modify our behaviors if we think about the ways in which we want to modify the ecosystem within which we engage with other people.
Do women cheat as much as men cheat?
It's a really tough question to answer. So we know, so if you look at the data, if you ask a scientist what percentage of people cheat, it's like somewhere between 40 and 65%. And you go, well, that's not right.
Right.
And in part it's because you ask, have you ever cheated in your life? Have you cheated in your current relationship? Have you cheated in the last year? And you get very different numbers. So a lot of people, like in their college relationships or sort of adolescent relationships, they're not entirely exclusive. So if you ask a lifetime question, you inflate that number. There's not a big sex difference. Now, the big issue is whether you define sexual infidelity and emotional infidelity differently. If you do, then you get a little bit of a sex difference. But a lot of researchers, and my friend Esther Perel, the psychotherapist, doesn't even like the term emotional infidelity. She's like, let's just stop talking about it, right? It's this idea that, what do you actually think that is? If you talk to someone at work about what bothers you, is that emotional infidelity?
Are we ready to do some questions from the audience? I think we could probably do 10 or 15 minutes and probably like 3 or 4 questions, and I might do one more. Yeah. So yeah, who has questions in the audience? Right here. There's a question right here.
Hi, my name is Morgan. Thank you so much. This has been fascinating. I was curious specifically about the topic you mentioned with younger people entering sexual experiences at a later time. And I was curious if you have studied any data around the increase in conversation around mental health, more acceptance to get on medications like SSRIs that tend to decrease sex drive. Curious if that applies to the adolescent age, or if you see ties across the board, because I think a lot of dialogue around that is that it decreases sex drive, but curious if you've studied that
or
at
just
all.
decreases the ability to have an orgasm. So
Yeah.
you have a huge swath of America not able to have an orgasm, which would clearly be affecting their life.
Yeah, and because it affects your motivation.
Right.
For continuing. So we did a study years ago. We asked people if they were on SSRIs, so selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, which are one class of antidepressants, and then SNRIs, which act on the norepinephrine system, different type of antidepressant. And what we found is that about 14% of people on SSRIs said that they had blunted romantic feelings. So even before, the sort of step before thinking about sex, they just weren't interested in a partner. So part of that is when you take antidepressants, you try and often level out your mood. But you can, part of romantic love, so back to you, I didn't really answer your question, but this reminds me that I didn't answer your question, sorry, Susan. And when we think about how we define romantic love, it's a physiological response. You get butterflies in your stomach, you get...
It's a little bit crazy.
Yeah, it's anxiety.
Right? It's the up and down and the up and down, yeah.
It's physiologically anxiety, it's that up and down. So if you're on medication that's trying to level that out, you actually don't get that rush, that feeling of passion often, right? So we know that that's the effect. We also know that a lot of antidepressants have a huge sexual side effects. It's funny, my colleagues of mine that are sex researchers a lot take, if you are on SSRIs, Wellbutrin, because it has the least number of sexual side effects. And I remember once being at a conference and I was like, what are you on? What are you on? What are you on? Because it was interesting of people, they were like, well, as sexologists, they were worried about the effects on their sex drive. And so we know that that's the case, but there's also a lot of medications, so actually also cardiovascular meds. So the classic finding that is as people age, we see a decrease in sexual frequency. A wonderful study by colleagues of mine at University of Chicago, Ed Lauman's team, if you control for medication use, particularly cardiovascular drugs, that slope is not actually that you don't have the huge decline in sexual frequency with age. Part of that is driven by the types of, as we age, we start to get on more and more prescriptions. And a lot of them can affect our sexual function. And there's two issues there. One is, does it affect your sexual function, orgasm, erectile dysfunction? The other is, does it just affect your desire, the mood?
Your effort.
Yeah.
Right? Your effort.
Yeah. The desire, the motivation, that kind of.
More questions?
Good question.
Yeah.
Hey, what's up?
Hey. Oh, yeah.
Oh, cool. My name's Jet. And I guess one thing I've noticed through this conversation is that you run into a lot of difficulties with quantification of the statistics. Mm-hmm. Like in this, at first it was race, and then it was religion, and then it's gender, or so on and so forth. And now we're talking about prescriptions. So I guess my biggest question to you is, through all your research throughout these years, what is the biggest outlier, or I guess what am I trying to say? Like structural difficulty that you run into when you're trying to approach this question from all these many different angles that it can take?
Yeah, thank you, Jed. This is a really good question. In part because as I tend to do a lot of large-scale quantitative data. So I'll do, like we did a study on what keeps passion alive in couples in 55,000 Americans, or I'll look at 5,000 single Americans. So in some ways, it gives you the power to say, what are patterns? And it gives us the power, like we did a study on sexual orientation and orgasm that I could talk about, that because we had enough in our sample, we had enough people of different sexual orientations. What we lose is some of that finer, so I don't do qualitative, sort of that finer, plenty of my colleagues do, so it's not to say that the work's not being done, but you lose some of those sort of finer grain patterns. So what we see is there certainly are differences by religion, by race, by ethnicity, so it's just a matter of kind of what, in what case and why. So if I'll take an example of sexual satisfaction in religion, so we know that that varies, but part of that, it depends on what type of religion. So just looking at religiosity isn't really helpful. I had a graduate student who worked on Mormonism. And Mormons are a really interesting case because religiously, they actually preach that sexual satisfaction is really important for a marriage and it's important to get into the afterlife, their version of heaven. But it's a group that really practices no premarital sex. So they go in there, they have their wedding night, they're on the way to their wedding, their mothers will tell women, like, you better be good tonight because if you want to go to heaven. And so you have these, so to your point, like if we look at race or ethnicity, then we start to get into, well, what's happening with Black Americans and Hispanic Americans and Asian Americans and Asians, and they're sort of different effects. And part of that is, the thing that I'm interested in is it's not that those groups necessarily have different interests or desires. Partly we'll see structural. So we know that racial categories are stigmatized differently on online dating, and is a great example, right? That we'll know that Black men and women are viewed as more sexually aggressive. Asian men are viewed as more feminine. Hispanic men are viewed as more sexual. So that then shapes who's swiping, who's messaging, and also the types of people. Because if you're looking for someone who's sexual, then that impacts what races you're looking at. If you have a sort of racist view about what those different categories are. So I'm rambling, I realize, but it's partly because your question brings up a bigger methodological issue of like it kind of depends as you sort of dive into what question it is that you want to look at. Those factors, those individual factors, play out differently. Yeah, thanks. That's a really good question. We could talk for hours. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm Hannah, and I definitely read your hookup stuff in college. So thank you for all that great literature. Can you share some of the trends or findings that make you most concerned, and then conversely, the ones that give you the most hope? So I guess kind of like what's keeping you up at night and what's getting you out of bed in the morning from a scientific finding perspective.
Oh my God, this is so vulnerable. I guess a couple things on keep me like what keep me up at night. One is I've always been interested in this question, and it's going to sound dumb, so I'm sorry, everyone. But I've always been interested in this question of why is it that we can be so wildly attracted, and anyone, you'll know in a moment that I've had this, and many of you have had this, why we can at some point in our life be so wildly attracted to someone that's such a bad relationship, right? And that I mean, there's part of me that kind of says, like, hasn't biology figured this out in 4 million years? And but actually it's I think a profound issue of what draws us to, we assume that what draws us to people, that it's good, we're drawn to it, we want it, right? But in fact, why that isn't always the right chemistry for a relationship, the right mix, and why both of you, it doesn't mean that the people are problematic. You could have other relationships that are just fine, but something that complexity. The other thing that keeps me up at night is actually on breakups, on relationship dissolution. We know, so we've done a study in my lab where we look at when people break up, what are all the things they do? Do they abuse alcohol and drugs? They go have sex with 3 people that weekend. They do nothing. They're depressed. They gain 10 pounds. They lose 10 pounds. And all actual reactions we've seen reported. But then you go through one breakup, and let's say you drink 6 bottles of wine, and then you go through another breakup, and then you're depressed. And then you go through another breakup, and you have sex with 3 people that weekend. that's really interesting because it's not a linear, it's not suggesting that I have an individual characteristic of how I cope with relationship loss. There's something dynamic about each relationship. That actually does keep me up at night because it's a riddle of figuring out behaviorally, why is it that we go down these different paths? And relationship loss is so difficult for so many people. When I think
Turns out more for men, though, maybe
more
for
for
women,
me,
right?
and I think how people cope with that and respond to that, and how it shapes their future relationships. The third thing that keeps me up at night, and then I'm going to get positive. I'll get warm. I'm sorry, Susan. I'm in a rut at the moment.
It's okay. I know Andrea has a question over there.
Oh,
She's
good.
going to bring us up.
Oh, good. Is a lot of the literature, particularly on trans youth, and what keeps me up about it is it's such a nuanced literature that we often see groups making very bold statements, both researchers, clinicians, advocates. And as a scientist, the literature is so nuanced and so complex that I think sort of everyone is overplaying their hand in terms of what the data actually tell us.
Oh, we talked about this when we were walking over tonight. Yeah.
Yeah. So, but what I'm happy about is we had one study at the Kinsey Institute, that 86% of couples said the pandemic made their relationship better. And in some ways, I think when we think about this extraordinary, do you ever think about this, Susan? I sometimes think like in 10 years, what are we going to remember about this time that we were in, this remarkable time in human sociality? And the fact that most people report that they're trying new things in their relationship, they're still trying to find ways to connect, whether it's on Zoom or whether it's video dating, that such a overwhelming majority said their relationships got better. And because people in relationships said, I realized I could rely on my partner. I realized that they were there when I needed them the most. This was the ultimate test. Why do we do this grand experiment?
We were also a little
in the
bit
first
too
place?
scared to go out and have more choice, right? Because you were scared you were going to get sick or something.
Yeah, but people certainly were separating, right? I mean, like relationships that had domestic violence, there were people who really struggled during COVID. But you're right. It was sort of also the fear of but it made us, I think, focus on appreciation of what we have or what the positives are. That actually, I think, is a testament to the power of human relationships. And I'm actually quite positive of that. I think we're going in a great place.
We're not going to quite end on that, though. I feel like we should. Andrea, did you have a question over there?
You're not as
This is
positive
going to be
as
the
I am?
last question. No. I have one more question, then we're going to wrap it up.
This will be very macro, but I think of the drivers of the research over time: feminism, availability of birth control. So many different big historical moments that have driven your research and found new dawns for this topic. But what is the last 15 years of social media going to be for you and the scientists in your realm? Like, how are you going to describe it if you could look forward 20 years when you're talking about it?
Oh gosh, just hold my head and say what happened. So I often think that when we think of all those moments, I'm a gender studies professor, so I certainly often think about the sort of role of feminist movements, contraception, and how it shapes people's sexual lives. But I think the two biggest moments in human evolution that have really shaped courtship in our relationships are the agricultural revolution, because it 12,000 years ago, because it fundamentally changed what was at stake in our relationships. Suddenly, marriage was a contract that was a little bit different than just sort of connecting with someone you're attracted to. There were resources at stake. There was a deal that was brokered. And then the other, I think, is the internet. And I think the internet has changed. What I don't think it's changed, and I don't think it can change, is our capacity for connection, our desire for sex, our desire for love, we're a curious animal. But the way we connect. I often think about these apps. The challenge with the apps is that, for millions of years, we heard someone's voice, we smelled them, we felt them, we knew their real social network, we tasted them, we invoked all the bodily senses in the courtship process. And we've separated from that. And there's not great evidence that it makes relationships better or worse. It's just such a different challenge for us as a species. And so I think, to your point, when we look back, the question is, how are things like, are we modeling behavior based on what we see on social media? We do. Guppies do it. Guppies do what's called mate copying. So female guppies will actually. This is so cool. So female guppies will mate with a male that an older female mated with earlier. And actually, chimps do the same thing. Male chimpanzees prefer females with long breasts because it suggests that she breastfed. She had fertility capacity. So when we look at the animal kingdom around us, and then we think, what are we doing as this social primate with these phones, or how we're getting a guidance? So this is a window into my world. I see us as this like lost primate with phones, and that's what I said. So you all look like chimps. I'm sorry, and we. I think that struggle, but also the opportunity. The cool thing about the phones and the apps is the enormous opportunity. The ability to find someone who plays pickleball or who's interested in your particular foot fetish. Foot fetish is the most common fetish, or whatever it is that you're looking for, right? And that capacity we have with the internet and with technology to connect on all sorts of new levels. But it's also it's such a challenge for people to figure that out, right? How to leverage that to find the right person, to connect, to make our romantic and our sexual lives better. I'm not really answering your question because I don't know. I think the big question is, will we figure out as a species, how to leverage that opportunity to make our relationships better, or are we going to flounder for another 15 years? I think we're sort of on the precipice. I don't know the answer.
I have one final question, and then I think we're going to wrap it up for the evening. How easy or hard is it for the Kinsey Institute to raise money? He did not ask me to ask this. Because for many startups in the sexual wellness space, a lot of venture capital firms have vice clauses. And it's not necessarily that the VCs have a vice clause, it's that they're limited partners where they get the money from. Perhaps the sovereign wealth fund of Malaysia or wherever it is, Singapore, doesn't want to be investing in sexual wellness. Mm-hmm. So that can make it difficult for startups to raise money in the traditional Silicon Valley way. So for you, an academic institution, you have to seek, you work with Match. How easy or hard is it for you to raise money for your projects?
Yeah, thanks for asking that. It's So if we look at the Kinsey Institute as an example, sort of the world's leading sex research institute, all these faculty of different disciplines and backgrounds. So we have a base budget from Indiana University. About 35% of our budget is based on grants and contracts. So some of that are things like Match.com. We have they fully fund research. The big trick for us when we work with companies is that we need to maintain, as academics, we need to maintain authority over analyzing those results, publishing those results. Not all companies are okay with those agreements. Right. So we'll sometimes do fee-for-service contracts, but we don't really view it as research. It's sort of like a different source of income to keep the lights on. But for the most part, we have another one with Live Jasmine. As some of you know, it's a camming site. It's the largest camming site in the world of cam models. Like Live, you can log on Live and say, talk to me, take your shirt off, and you put money into camming and sort of I can talk about that later. And so we have a lot of these partnerships with different companies. We did one with KY on Touch.
What about government funding? Is that hard or easy to get?
Yeah, so the government funding, what happens is if we write a federal grant, and this happens to our faculty all the time, there are certain areas. So if you're working on HIV, it's okay to talk about sex. If you're working on contraceptives, it's okay to talk about sexual reproduction. But for us, if I write a grant about orgasm, you could not get orgasm funded by the federal government. Not going to happen. And I've written quite a lot on orgasm. I'm interested in it as a biologist because it's both a physiological response, but it's also subject to social context. And so the program officers will call and say, can you take sex out of the title? And you're like, okay, fine. Because they're worried about the legislature calling them. And they say, if I have 500 grants I'm going to push through, the one on sex is just not worth, this kerfuffle. So then you say, okay. And then they call 2 weeks later and they say, can you take sex out of the abstract? And you're like, oh, God, okay. And then they call 2 weeks later and they say, can you just take sex out of the grant? And you go, we're a sexological institute. What do you want me to write about? So there really is a sense that, so as an example, we know a lot more about gay men's sex lives than we know about lesbian women. Because for gay men, you can tether it to HIV risk and you can problematize their sex life as a disease risk. So you can get it funded.
So you can get money.
Yeah. So it's often there's a lot of concerns about that, right? About how we medicalize sexuality. I mean, I have an appointment in the medical school. I don't have a problem with thinking of medical issues, but we medicalize people's daily sexual lives in order to get it funding for it. And then a big part, 40% of the institute's philanthropy is fundraising, and it's lots of individual donors, and then people who are helping us with things like endowed chairs and endowed curators to kind of continue the work we do.
Well, congratulations. It's the Kinsey Institute's 75th anniversary this year.
Yeah.
We didn't get to any questions. What was it, like 73 years ago?
Yeah.
But congratulations, and thank you so much for agreeing to have this chatter. And thank you so much for the Greene Space for having POSTHOC here. For the first time, we're so thrilled to be here. So thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you. Thank you, Susan.